Chapter 1. The Garden Fate That Ended in Silence. Marleycombe, nestled between the Cotswold Hills and a road most missed unless they meant to find it, was a village where time lingered politely. The river flowed like syrup past the ivy-draped bridge. The postman's quiet cough punctuated his rounds, and the villagers prided themselves on cherishing what mattered and forgetting what didn't. Only one event stirred this tranquil place: the annual garden fete, held with unwavering precision on the first Saturday of June in the rectory's sprawling gardens. A tradition older than the vicarage's bricks, it was revered as deeply. By 3 o'clock, the gardens hummed. Tables wore embroidered linens, cakes stood on tiers like hopeful contestants, and rhubarb jam jars gleamed like treasures in the sun. Bees wove through roses. The vicar's Labrador snored beneath a bench, and Mrs. Greta Pembry, for the third time that hour, declared her lemon drizzle cakes Women's Institute ribbon was earned through pure, unartificial essence. Children darted across the lawn, hands sticky with toffee, as Jane Marple, in a pale lavender hat that lent her the air of a faded bloom, sat quietly near the trellis, sipping weak tea, her smiles rare and reserved. It was, as many would later whisper, a day that made murder seem impossible. A scream, high, raw, torn from feared cells, shattered the idol. Silence fell, thick and sudden, followed by gasps and hurried footsteps on grass. The sound had come from the far side of the garden, near the greenhouse where rare orchids bloomed. Miss Marple didn't rise. Curved fingers curled around her teacup's delicate handle. Her head turned slowly. She listened not to the scream, now gone, but to the voices of discovery, the rustle of panic, the reactions. Miranda Toiver, the young florist from Church Street, stumbled into view, pale as wax, her mouth working soundlessly. "He's dead," someone cried. In the greenhouse, another voice added, sharper, "It's Mr. Daffodil, he's been stabbed." Gasps scattered like leaves in a gust. The vicar dropped his hymn sheet. Mrs. Pembry fainted theatrically, and children were whisked away. Through it all, Miss Marple sat, eyes scanning faces. A man lighting a cigarette with trembling hands, ignoring the no smoking sign. By the greenhouse, a woman clutching her handbag as if it held salvation. Others whispering, "Leonard Daffodil." No, couldn't be. So quiet. Sergeant Albert Finch arrived 20 minutes later, barrel-chested and red-faced, a village lawman more at ease with fence disputes than corpses. Leonard Daffodil's body was still warm. A widower from London, he'd lived in Marleycombe only 10 months, renting Ivy's Inn cottage. Courteous, reclusive. He was known for one peculiar habit: sending flowers, not growing or selling them, just sending them. Now, in the greenhouse, he lay still, a mystery as vivid as the orchids around him. Anonymously, bouquets of lilies, too. The school teacher who'd returned after an illness, yellow roses, to Mrs. Pembry after her cat died, and red carnations to a married woman, whose name everyone agreed was better left unsaid. "Who found the body?" asked Finch. Notebook out, Miranda raised, a shoe tremble in hand. I went in to miss the ferns." Mr. Daffodil was lying on the floor. His eyes were open and there was blood. So, muck blood, Wright said. Finch's face already set in lines of doubt, right? No signs of forced entry knife wound upper abdomen. Single blow, likely close range, he said it loud. Enough for everyone to hear, perhaps hoping it would make him sound more competent. Miss Marple's lips thinned. "I'll need everyone to remain nearby," Finch added, "and no one touches anything." The villagers, now dazed and breathless, hovered near the tea tent. Some cried, some gossiped, some tried to piece together the strange puzzle of why anyone would want to kill a man who macely stayed indoors and sent floral arrangements, but Miss Marple, who had still not spoken, simply stood and walked slowly over to where the greenhouse now stood, roped off with red tape. She bent down slowly, knees protesting, and picked something up just outside the glass door, a petal crimson fragrant, a red carnation H. She murmured almost too quietly to hear how poetic the time season began to dip behind the trees. Marley Comb had changed the bunting, still fluttered the cake, still sat untouched, but everything felt still, like a villa Agatha had taken a deep breath and was afraid to let it out. Again Miss Marple returned, home to her rose-covered cottage, with her gloves still on, and a mind already several steps ahead of Sergeant Finch. She placed her walking stick beside the umbrella stand and retrieved the small item, key, tucked carefully in her bag. Not the flower, but something else, an envelope, white-scented. It had been slipped into her handbag during the confusion of that. She was certain she would never have picked it up. Otherwise, her hands, after all, were as particular as hair instincts. There was no name, no address, just a single sentence written in slanted cursive. Every flower is a message. His word, too loud. No signature, no explanation. Only that and a single pressed petal enclosed inside. Another carnation. Miss Marple stood still in Herdham hallway, the ticking of the grandfather clock, louder than it ought to have been, and as she read the note again, she said almost to herself, "Guys." Then it was never about kindness. It was about silence. Outside the village was quiet, but something had been set in motion, and Jane Marple, who knew flowers and people equally well, felt something strange bloom in her chest, not fear. Something closer to certainty. Chapter 2. A town full of whispering faces. By the next morning, Marley Comb had returned to its usual rhythm, but it was a rhythm off-key. The milkman still made his rounds. The morning paper was still thumped onto doorsteps with habitual indifference in the church. Bell rang softly at 8, but under the surface, everything had changed. Every nod of greeting was lasted. Suspicion, every polite smile, carried tension behind the teeth. Markham was the longer a village. It was a room full of suspects. Miss Marple, as was her custom, took her tea alone by the front window overlooking the gravel path where sparrows pecked without concern. Her morning routine was precise: a slice of dry toast, thin marmalade, one boiled egg, the Marley Comb Gazette, which she read from the society page backward. However, the front page was unavoidable murder at the fate local man killed during annual gathering by Thomas Ingram, staff correspondent. The article was riddled with speculation. Mr. Leonard Daffodil, aged 63, of Ivy's End Cottage, had been stabbed once in the upper chest. A clean wound, no murder weapon, found no known enemies, no clear motive. The police were interviewing attendees and had not ruled out any possibilities. Miss Marple folded the paper with a sigh. Speculation was dangerous. It became truth in small towns. Far quicker than Fatchy, Stewed fetched her gloves and tied a neat ribbon under her chin. There was work to be done, though not the kind Sergeant Finch imagined. She first stopped by the florist's, where Randa Toiver, still pale from the discovery, was behind the counter, mechanically arranging lilies. She clenched when the bell above the door chimed. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't expect you." "Poor thing, Miranda," Miss Marple said gently. "What a terrible shock for you. I do hope you're not here on your own." "My cousin's in the back," she replied, forcing a smile. "But I can't sit at home. I keep seeing him." "I understand," said Miss Marple, her eyes soft. "Would you tell me something, dear? When exactly did Mr. Daffodil last come into the shop?" Miranda blinked. Not recently. Maybe a week ago. He didn't buy anything, though. He just asked about delivery prices. 4 carnations red." "Yes, always red. It was his favorite." "Did he say who they were for?" "No, bet. He always sent them anonymously. 1 bouquet every month since he moved." charisma times more. Miss Marple nodded slowly. You keep records, app deliveries, not with names, just the addresses. But I don't think that would write too. I won't ask you to betray confidences. Dear, she said with a kin pat on Miranda's arm, but perhaps if you notice anything missing from your listlet. Me know sometimes a flower that isn't sent is more telling than one thetis. By midday, the post office was buzzing, not with letters or telegrams, but theories. Miss Palmer, the post mistress, a woman with an encyclopedic memory and a taste for intrigue, lowered her voice when Miss Marple entered there saying was having an affair, she whispered, leaning over the counter. With Mars Langdon, you know, the one who runs the dress shop with all those high collars, and never liked her too much perfume. For a married woman, I thought she was a widow just now, said Miss Palmer, eyes gleaming, but her. Albert died only last year, and I heard she was receiving flowers regularly read once. That's not a crime, Miss Marple said mildly. It is if they weren't. From Albert, she let the remark hang in the air, heavy with suggestion. Miss Marple made no comment. She thanked Miss Palmer, bought a new sheet of stamps she didn't need, and turned to leave Jane. Miss Palmer added, voice lower now. There's talk of someone seeing a man leaving the greenhouse before the screamer. Stranger, tall, gray coat. Not from here. Strangers don't often send flowers anonymously, said Miss Marple, and walked out at the police station. Sergeant Finch was wrestling with a stack of reports and a migraine. He looked up warily when Miss Marple entered. If this is about theories, Miss Marple, I'd ask you to let us handle this be the book. Oh, I wouldn't dream of interfering, she said sweetly, but I did wonder, have you spoken to Mrs. Langdon? Have, he said, frowning. She admitted to receiving flowers, said they were unsigned, but she assumed they were from. Mr. Daffodil claims they had tea once or twice, nothing crumper. And the other recipients he shifted, well, some won't say, embarrassed I suppose, think it's romantic. A few were frightened, said it was unwanted attention. But none said he ever approached them directly, so he made gestures, but stayed distant. Exactly. Keeps it harder to pin down motive unless someone was jealous or felt. Watched. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. Have you considered that Thekla might not have hated Mr. Daffodil, that it might have been regret doesn't drive a knife, said Finch, but it does make people say foolish things. I have half a mind to start searching the cottages for anything sure I wouldn't said. Miss Marple softly, the killer likely no longer has Dewey Pen. Finch looked up. Why not? Because whoever sent me a pressed carnationestity likely sent it after the murder, and killers who write poetic notes don't keep the blade. They destroy it, because deep down they want to, but only by the right person. She left him with that thought and walked out into the bright Marley afternoon, which now seemed far too golden for such a grim undercurrent. That evening she sat alone, sorting through the notes she had taken so far. She had gathered Mr. Daffodil's flowers to at least 5 women in the village, possibly more anonymously, all red carnations. Some women appreciated it, others feared it. No story of violence, no accusations of threats. His only connection was emotional or symbolic. He had left no clear pattern, no direct pursuit, just gestures, like a ghost present, but never tangible. And yet he was murdered. Not quietly, not subtly, but stabbed brutally. A contradiction, unless the killing was planned, unless it was a reaction, a breaking point, a line crossed. Miss Marple opened the pressed petal again, stared at it beneath the lamp. A symbol, a signature, a message, and slowly a theory began to bloom like a red carnation in mine's dark soil. Chapter 3. The widow and the envelope. Mrs. Evelyn Langdon lived alone in a modest but smartly kept housey, the end of Sycamore Lane, tucked just past the bakery and 2 doors down from the butcher's. Her shutters were always painted a fresh shade of pale blue, and her garden bloomed in symmetrical perfection. She dressed well, spoke with calculated warmth, and had that particular kind of widow's composure-net, quite grief, not quite freedom, that invited speculation. She had, over the past year, become the subject of numerous whisper-eyed conversions over tea cozies and biscuit tins. Albert Langton had died 12 months prior, a fall down the stairs. They said no foul play, only misfortunable, when Evine began to wear perfume again, something faint and floral pupillinatist. When she laughed a little louder at the village fair, people noticed. When red carnations began appearing at her doorstep on the last Friday of every month, people certainly noticed now with the murder of Mead. Daffodil, her name, was no longer the stuff of idle gossip. It had crept quietly to the center of the storm. Miss Marple did not countenance that would have been rude, and Evine Langton was the sort of woman who would nade us. Instead, she rang the bell mid-morning, clutching a small jar of quenchly and wearing her kindest expression. The door opened after a pause. Miss Marple, Anne said, surprised but not displeased. How thoughtful. Just a little something from the garden. Jane smiled. I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, Evelyn said. Please come in. I could use the distraction. The Langton sitting room was taste-effulcented. Faintly, with the rosewood polish and cinnamon on the mantel were framed photographs, Evine in her youth, Albert in uniform, and one black and white portrait that showed a young woman holding a bouquet of flowers. Her face unreadable. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to it. Is that you? Evelyn followed her eyesight. Take in the summer. I met Albert in Devon before he joined the war. He looked almost uncertain. She gave a short laugh. I was uncertain about many things. This saté was poured strong, with a splash of milky. Imagine. You've had quite a week, Miss Marple said. Gently, yes, Evelyn said, eyes flicking away. The police came yesterday, asked their questions. It was Alan Saddling. I understand, especially when your name is in other people's mouth. More than your own. Evelyn's hand holding her teacups, just slightly. Have they said much? Just usual that Mr. Daffodil sent you flowers. She gave a tight smile. He did every month without fail, but he never once included a note, never knocked on Theodore, never made himself known, just the carnations. And did you know who they were from? I suspected, of course, but we only ever had one proper conversation about books. Oddly enough, he noticed I'd bought Persuasion at Thedjumble's sale. He liked Austen, I thought. It odd. Miss Marple watched her closely. And how did it make you feel? The flowers, unnerved, flattered, a bit of both. Evine and Minothy were beautiful, but always just carnations. Never a change, as if he was saying something, but only in one language. One note, perhaps. He didn't know how else to say it, or didn't want to. There was a pause. Did you keep them? Miss Marple asked it softly. Ine's eyes lingered on the mantel. Again, not all, but yes. I pressed a few. They reminded me of something I couldn't quite explain. Easter. Someone had seen me, really seen me, even if it was from afar. Miss Marple placed her cup down. Forgive me, she said, but I must ask, did you receive one last Friday? The silence was thick. Evelyn blinked. No, she said, not last week. I thought it odd, but I didn't know what to make of it, so the pattern brooks. Nodded Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. If I may be direct, do you believe someone might have killed Mr. Daffodil because of the flowers? Orbic, he stopped sending them. The question hung there delicate and razor sharp. I don't know, she said slowly, but something has changed in this village essence. Albert died since Leonard came, since the flowers started. I feel watched sometimes, not by Leonard, by others. There's something under the surface. Here's something. Angry Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, have you said any other letters, envelopes? Honey, Massine froze. Then she stood, walked to the drawer beneath the photograph, and read her with a small white envelope, no stamp, no writing on the outside. Inside was a single pressed carnation brown now, and a note in slanted, cursive handwriting. Some flowers grow only in darkness. Be careful who sees them bloom. She placed it between them on the tea tray. I received it 3 days ago. Anne said no idea who from Miss Marple read the words. Again, her face unreadable. Then she carefully slid the note back into the envelope. Okay. I believe, my dear, she said slowly, that's a man is playing a very quiet, very dangerous game, and they want us to listen to their poetry before they strike again. That afternoon, Miss Marple took the envelope home. She sat by the hearth, studying the note beneath a magnifying glass. The handwriting was identical to the one she'd received. The phrasing, decent. Even the pressure on the paper all matched. A pattern was forming red carnations. Anonymity, sudden silence, and now cryptic warnings, delivered like riddles from someone watching the story. Unfold picked up her small black notebook and drew a single line between 3 names. Leonard Daffodil murdered Miss Marple, received a note. Mrs. Evan Langton received a note and was a known recipient of the flowers. Then drew a question mark next to one more name, still unconfirmed, who waste 3rd recipient, because there was always a 3rd in these things in Louvain. It's jealousy and murder, and that 3rd person, Miss Marple suspected, had no intention of staying quiet much longer. Chapter. For the 3rd recipient, it was always the 3rd name that mattered most. The one no one talked about. The first could be explained, the second justified, but the third lingered, like smoke from a fire. No one saw that was the person, with something tell. Hide. Miss Marple knew this instinctively, not from books or polished manuals, but from years of quiet observation at bridge tables, funeral teases, garden parties, and wartime sewing circles. People never told you the whole story. They told you the parts they thought made them look kind or clever or righteous. The rest, the raw, unpolished truth, lived in the things left unsaid, which is why by Sunday morning she was walking toward the high street with her handbag tucked neatly under her arm and a mind full of calculated curiosity. Her destination was the cottage of Miss Lavinia Pike, a retired school teacher with a spine so straight one might have mistaken it for still. Lavinia had taught generations of motley children how to write with proper posture and never speak with a full mouth. She lived alone, rarely smiled, and had a particular fondness for pressed flowers, which she framed, labeled, and displayed in rows on her parlor wash. Also, as Miss Marwell knew, had once taught Leonard Daffodil years ago in London. Their paths had crossed again quite by accident when Leonard arrived in Marley last year. A curious coincidence, some thought, but Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences when a corpse was involved. Miss Pike opened the door in a gray wool skirt and matching cardigan buttoned to the throat. Her silver hair was braided neatly into a crown around her head. Miss Marple, she said, voice clipped. Is this a social call? Only if you'd like it to be. Jane smiled. I've brought a book. I thought you might enjoy. Lavinia raised one eyebrow. You suspect of something. I suspect everyone of something, Miss Marple replied gently. But mostly, I'm just thinking out loud. May I come in? There was a pause, then a small note. Inside Lavinia's home was as rigidly ordered as her appearance. Not a speck half dust, not a single cushion out of place. The walls bore her pressed flowers, violets, cornflowers, foxgloves, all arranged with the precision of a scientific specimen. But there, in the center frame, above the mantel, was a red carnation, slightly wilted. Press it flat. Miss Marple let her eyes linger there. I always thought carnations rather unsettled, she said softly. They are, said Lavinia, but sometimes unsubtle things are sent with subtle intent. Was this one sent to you? There was no reply, just a long, narrow look. I ask because I've received one. So has Mrs. Langton, both with notes, both written by the same hand, both after Leonard Daffodil was found stabbed in the greenhouse. I paused then. I didn't receive your note, just the flower that came the day before the fate, miss. Marple blinked the day before Lavinia nodded. No name, no message. It was simply placed at my gate, not even wrapped. How did it make you feel unsettled? She said, quietly and annoyed. I disliked being reminded of things that should stay buried. Jane watched her. Did you know Leonard? Well, I knew him, she said, as a boy and then as a man. But no, not well had changed. He was more reserved when he came here, always walking alone, writing Sami. At times, I think he fancied himself a poet. Was there any tension between you, Lavinia? Met her eyes. We had a falling out, long ago, about ethics. He betrayed a friend, took credit for a piece of writing. That wasn't his, never admitted it. I knew, and he knew I knew, that was enough to indict it. Friendship. Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment. I think, she said, at last, someone believes Leonard said his flowers, with meaning that they were more than kindness, that they were confessions or provocations. Lavinia gave a cold smile at them. Someone has a poet's imagination, or a murderess. Miss Marple left shortly after, her mind sharper than when she'd Aravetno. The timeline shifted. Mrs. Langton regularly received flowers. None last Friday, Miss Marple received flower with poetic warning after the murder. Miss Pike received a flower before the murder without a note that changed things. If killer sent the carnation to Miss Pike, then the murder was likely premeditated. Planet flower wasn't a signature of grief. It was a prelude to silence, and if Flannel had truly wronged someone long ago and returned without apology, then the flower wasn't a gift, it was a challenge. That evening, Miss Marple placed all 3 envelopes, hers, Eline's, and Lavinia, side by side. Same caper, same perfume, same flower, but only 2 had notes. The third was blank, ominously blank. Someone, she realized, had sent themselves a flower or had failed to destroy the one they sent, which Meanthus wasn't just a mystery of emotion. It was a play, a performance, and every flower was a scene in progress. She glanced toward the curtained window half, expecting someone to be watching from the street, because that was the other thing about the third recipient. They always knew more than they let in. Chapter 5. The note that wasn't written. It had rained during the night, as soft, persistent drizzle that left the village of Marleum washed, and muted window panes were beaded with droplets. Flower beds darkened with damp. Canjamie smoke curled sluggishly into the gray morning air inside her cottage. Miss Marple stirred her tea absent-mindedly, her gaze fixed on the 3 envelopes laid before her like vadance in a courtroom. Each had once contained a red carnation. 2 included nets full of veiled warnings and cryptic messages, but one, Miss Pike's, hadn't a message at all. The omission spoke louder than any words could have it. Was too deliberate to silence. Silence, Miss Marple had learned, it was often a smoke-axe scream for something darker. This wasn't random, it was composed. And that, she thought grimly, made it art, and art always has. Anarchist. The bells from St. Edmund's rang out at 10, startling a pair of black birds from the churchyard. Miss Marple was already walking briskly along the gravel lane by then, heading not toward the scene of the crime. The greenhouse still taped off and patrolled by a bored constable, but instead to the one place seen, Marley, where paper whispered louder than people. The village library. Marshal de Garde, Prim the librarian, was a woman of spidery limbs, unfailing memory, and suspiciously precise lipstick. She was also, perhaps unknowingly, the keeper of some of Marley Combs' most carefully hidden secrets. You could tell a lot about people, Miss Marple often said, by what they chose to borrow. Oh, Jane, Hildegard said with surprise as the door chimed, haven't seen you in days. I'm after something very specific today, Miss Marple replied, removing her gloves. Something dreadful. I hope all of anyone's been reading lately. are detective novels. You'd think they'd have had enough. A crime this week. Real crime doesn't come with chapter endings. Miss Marple Hildegard gave a sniff of agreement. I wonder, Jane continued, Havo noticed if Mr. Daffodil Leonard had borrowed any books. Recently Hildegard's eyes narrowed him. Oh yes. Weekly visits. Never spoke much. Al was setting things early. Do you keep a log, of course? She said, insulted. Strictly alphabetical. Wait, here. She disappeared. Behind a creaking partition. A few minutes passed when she returned. She held a small ledger, thumbed to that section. Last 4 books, poems of regret, and reproach, love letters of the Great War florography, the language of flower sand, oh, the art of anonymous correspondence, all borrowed in the last 6 weeks, Miss Marple blinked slowly. He certainly wasn't borrowing cookbooks, Schildig laughed, despite herself strange. Man, that one always had ink on his cuffs. I thought he might be writing something. Himself, a memoir perhaps. Or notes, Miss Marple murmured. What was that? Nothing at all. Jane smiled at me. Who else borrowed that florography book? Hildegard turned a few pages. Only one other name since January, Miss Lavinia Pike. By early afternoon, Miss Marple was sitting in the far corner of the Gilded Teacup, the village's one respectable cafe with a fruits cone. She had no real intention of feeding in a pot of chamomile tea. Opposite her sat Nora Penwell, younger than most in Malacombe, recently returned from a brief, unsuccessful marriage in Sussex. She lived alone in a small flat above the stationer's and had a habit of biting her lip when she was nervous. Nora, Miss Marple said gently, I've always found you to be observant. Oh, I'm not, she said too quickly. That's what makes you so good at it. You don't try. Nora looked down. Is this a Booth murder? Partly, but also about what came before at you. See, someone has gone to great lengths to send flowers and notes, to speak without being heard, and I believe someone may have overheard. More than there. Willing to admit, Nora glanced over her shoulder. The cafe was mostly empty, and shouldn't say she whispered, I don't want trouble. I understand, but the trouble has already happened. Speaking of it may help prevent the next. Nora hesitated, then leaned forward. A week before the fete, I saw someone outside Spike's cottage late at night. A man, tall, wearing a gray coat. He left something at the gate. I thought it was rubbish or letter. He walked away quickly. I didn't see his face. Did go toward Ivy's End. Nora nodded. Was it Leonard? I don't know, she said, her voice tightening, but I think he'd been watching the house before, a few times, standing across the road, always alone. Miss Marple felt something click into place. Thank you, Nora. That may be more important than you realize. Back home, Jane laid out her notes again. Leonard had read about flowers, love letters, and anonymity. He had some carnations, likely as messages. He had left one for Lavinia without a note. The silence was not accent to Laura. Saw a man at Lavinia's house, possibly Leonard. The flower was left at night. He was watching. But why then? She opened her notebook and wrote a single line. The note that wasn't written was all ready now. What if Lavinia didn't need a note? What if the absence was the message of their shared history? The betrayal Leonard never confessed had been quiet line latched by the delivery of that one red flower. It was in effect a confession APS offering, but one Lavinia had no interest in accepting. So the question was, did she kill him, or had someone else read too deeply into what was meant to stay silent that night? As wind rattled the cottage windows and the rain returned in sudden cold sheets, Miss Marple stood alone in her hallway, holding all 3 envelopes in one hand. She lit a small fire, not for warmth, but for clarity, and she whispered aloud as if to someone in the dark corner of the room. There's a 4th envelope, isn't there, young? Haven't seen yet, and it won't contain a flower. It will contain a name. Chapter 6, The fourth envelope. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving Marley veiled in a fine mist. The cobbled roads glistened like stone, polished by grief, and puddles mirrored the graying sky above. Villagers moved more quietly that day. Doors closed a little quicker. Curtains fluttered back into place as Miss Marple walked past. The murder had entered its sunken phase, the phase of stillness. But Miss Marple knew better than to mistake silence for peace. People were listening now, and Simeon somewhere was deciding what to do next. Exactly 9:30. A boy from the butcher's shop arrived at Miss Marple's door, Capiscu, holding a small white envelope between ink-stained fingers. "Post for you, miss," mumbled, not meeting her eye. "Thank you, Henry," she sagely taking it from him. There was no stamp, no address, just her name, Brittany, the same thin, slanted script she had now memorized. This one felt heavier, shed and open it immediately. Instead, she brought it inside and placed it flat on the kitchen table beside a fresh pot of tea, and her wire-rimmed, spectacled envelope was sealed with a wax stamp. This time, a detail not present. In earlier letters, a faded imprint, a flower. She broke the seal. Inside was a folded knot. No flower, no poetry, just a single line. "The widow has lied. Ask her what she burned." Miss Marple did not move for several seconds. Then she exhaled, slowly, deliberately. So it was beginning. Irritated. Evine Langdon's home. Less than an hour later. Walking stick, tapping the damp flagstone's. Eyes alert behind her spectacles. Anne answered the door in a soft blue dress. Mascara slightly smudged us, though she'd wept recently, but refused to reapply. "Jane," she said, "surprised you're early. I believe someone's trying to frighten you," Miss Marple said. Without preamble, Eline's face palled. "What do you mean?" Jane said, holding out the envelope. "It arrived an hour ago with handwriting. Key matches the other notes, but this time there's no flower, just an accusation." Evelyn took the note with trembling fingers. Read, sat down. "I didn't lie," she said. "Not exactly. That's not what the note claims." "It's not a lie," she said again, her voice gaining firmness. "It's just something I didn't mention." Jane waited. Evelyn hesitated, then stood, walked to the fireplace, pulled something from behind the grate. It was a metal tin, scorched on one side. She opened outside with a blackened remains of paper, burnt edges, ash, and fragments. 20 nights before the fete, Evelyn said. This was pushed through my letterbox. It had no flower. Just a poem, but not like the others. Miss Marple leaned in, brows drawn at. "Said he gave you what was never yours to keep." Evelyn's eyes glistened. "It frightened me. It felt cruel, like someone wanted me to feel guilty, so I destroyed it, because you did feel guilty." "No," she said, a bit too quickly. "Not about Lenardi. Was just kind, that's all." Miss Marple looked again at the tin. "This note didn't come from Leonard," she said calmly. "No." Evelyn whispered, "I don't think it did. There was a beat, and you didn't think to tell the police." Ivine turned her face away. "I didn't want to be dragged into something I didn't understand. I didn't kill him, Jane, but you'd think someone wants me to think I could have driven someone else to buy the time, miss." Marple returned home. The questions had multiplied. Who knew Evelyn had destroyed a letter? Who wrote the fourth envelope? Why send it to her and not the police? Unless the killer wasn't afraid of the police at all. Only Offbone, seen clearly by someone like Miss Marple, someone who understood people's need, who noticed absences. She went to the kitchen, pulled out her small black notebook, and flipped back to her first entry. 3 recipients on, dead to frightened, and now a 4th. Flop. No flower, no verse, just accusation. Shift had occurred. This was no longer a matter of who had received what. Now it was about what each person had done in response. She sat by the fire late into the evening, watching the flames as she considered. It's the nature of guilt, not legal guilt, but private, hidden guilt, the kin to that. Was a smile in public and wrings his hands in the dark. Who would write Sokka a note? Someone smart, observant, mean, with access to Everline's postbox. Someone who knew about the Latours, but wasn't a recipient themselves. An outsider or someone Pozingas. One, at midnight, a knock came at her door. Not loud, not urgent. Just a soft, precise rapping. She opened it to find Nora Pinwell, her coat-soaked hair clinging to her forehead. "I need to tell you something," she whispered. "Come in, dear." Nora stepped inside, shivering. "I think I know how," wrote the notes. Miss Marple didn't interrupt. Nora swallowed. "I think it's Emil, who never received a flower, but wanted to. Someone who hated watching Leonard send them to others. Someone who knew everything." Miss Marple blinked. "Who?" Nora said a name that made the flame in the hearth hiss. A name Miss Marple had quietly suspected all along. Chapter 7. The name that burned. The storm was far from over. The rain had returned, with renewed fury, slashing against the window panes and soaking the village once again in a damp veil. Inside Miss Marple's cottage, the warm from the fire was a stark contrast to the chilly night outside, but feeling of warmth was fleeting. Nora Pinwell's words still echoed in the room, cold and sharp. "It was Mrs. Margaret Parker," Nora said, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple did not respond immediately. She let the name hang in the air, rolling over her like thunder before a storm. Broke Mrs. Margaret Parker, the widow of the late Albert Parker, who had been one of the first to express concern over Leonard Daffodil's arrival in Marliam, and who had also been one of the first to react when Leonard's flowers began to make their quiet, enigmatic appearance in the village. "Why, Mrs. Parker?" Miss Marple pleased gently, her voice soft but intent. "What makes you think it was her?" Nora shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting to the flames. "Because she's been watching all of us. She started coming to the library just before Leonard arrived, borrowing books on unspoken things. Not the sort of books, like her should read." Miss Marple did not flinch, shelling forward, her fingers tapping gently on the edge of her chair. "I've seen her," Nora continued, standing by the window, looking out, watching people go. "He thought I was imagining it at first, but when I saw her look at Mrs. Langton one morning, I knew something was wrong. It was a cold look, as if she was angry that someone else could receive what she had been denied. And the flowers?" Miss Marple asked, her tone quiet but sharp. Nora's gaze dropped to her hands, which were folded tightly in her lap. "She never received any flowers. She told me once years ago that she never got gifts from Albert, that he always forgot her birthday, and Leonard, he started sending flowers to all these other women. I don't think she could stand it, the way he was making all of them feel special, important. I think it drove her mad. She wanted him to see her, but he never did." Miss Marple's thoughts swirled. There was a stillness in her chest, a calm that came from years of observing the tides of human nature, waiting for the precise moment when everything would click into place. "Sure, she didn't mean to kill him," Nora added, hurriedly, as though trying to justify herself. "But she must have done something, Miss Marple. She had motive, and she was angry enough to hurt him." "Maybe she didn't mean for him, Toady, but Nora," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "tell me more about Margaret's relations with Leonard." "You said she had been watching him," yes, Nora said, her voice catching in her throat. "For months, she would stand in her window and watch him walk by, and when he started sending flowers to the others, he'd think it was the final straw." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. This was it. Chapter 5. Shadows of doubt. The village of Rose Hill hummed with unease as dusk settled over its cobblestone streets. A grave had been disturbed, a stranger had arrived, and whispers of a letter from the dead, hinting at a possible inheritance, whirled through teacups and church pews. One name surfaced repeatedly in hushed tones. Miss Marple. She must know more than she's letting on, muttered Ernest Demise, the hardware shop owner, polishing a wrench. Oh, she knows everything, replied Morwen Ellis, not lifting her eyes from her hymn book. At her cottage, Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table, folding lace handkerchiefs with deliberate care. Her mind, however, was elsewhere, circling the facts like a hawk over a field. Stranger claiming to be her son, a forged narrative backed by photographs and a letter, a disturbed gray vignette. No direct confrontation, only implications. This was no amateur's work. It was calculated. Steady, she decided it was time to step from the shadows. Wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, she made her way to the Crown and Feather, where the stranger, John Morrow, had returned that afternoon and was reportedly dining alone. Inside the inn, a low fire crackled and the scent of beef stew hung in the air. Regulars hunched over tankards, glancing at Miss Marple as she entered. Mrs. Reeves raised an eyebrow but said nothing. John Morrow sat at the same corner table as before, looking up from his roast lamb as she approached. "Miss Marple," he said softly, "I wasn't sure I'd see you again. I imagine you hoped I wouldn't." He gestured to the empty chair. "Please, sit, if you'd like." She remained standing, hands folded over her bag. "I have a question," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Who gave you that photograph?" He hesitated, not with surprise, but with calculation. "A man in London," he replied. "He runs an archive of estate documents. He claimed to know Lydia. Said she passed him a box of personal effects before her death. It had the photo and a letter. Did you see Lydia yourself?" "Oh," he said plainly. "I never claimed to be her son. Only that she wrote as though she and you made an arrangement that you bore a child, Taba, and she took care of the matter." Miss Marple's eyes didn't waver. "You speak like someone who's rehearsed." John smiled faintly. "You're a remarkable woman, but even remarkable people have secrets. Not the kind you're fabricating." She reached into her bag and produced a copy of the letter she'd received that morning. "Did this come from the same man?" He studied it for a long moment. "Yes, that handwriting. I've seen it before." She tucked the letter away. "You've been clever," she said, turning to leave, "but not clever enough." He stood. "I didn't come here to deceive you." "Then why did someone disturb Lydia's grave last night?" she asked. He paled. "I don't know what you mean, don't you?" she said, pausing at the door before stepping into the night. By morning, Rose Hill was on edge. Spectre Cray had posted to constables at the churchyard. Mrs. Featherston patrolled the village with her knitting, eavesdropping as only she could. The vicar prepared a sermon on truth, and the bank manager was rechecking Lydia Hargrave's accounts for suspicious activity. Miss Marple, however, was in her garden, clipping lavender. When the postman delivered a telegram at 10:43 a.m., she accepted it without surprise. To Jane Marple, Rose Hill, village records found. No listing of childbirth or adoption in your name. However, curiosity, L. Hargrave, listed as emergency guardian for J.M., male infant. No date of death, no record of transfer. Strange gap, investigating further. Simpson, Bath Archives. Miss Marple read the note, her gaze drifting across her garden. The birds chirped, the breeze swayed the trees, but nothing was as it seemed. There had been a baby not hers, and perhaps not Lydia's either. Someone had slipped into the records, altered details, and woven a lie from forgotten pieces. But why tie Lydia's name to a falsehood? She turned toward the road leading to the vicarage. Something was missing, but not for long. Chapter 6. Secrets. Beneath St. Jude's Church stood at Rose Hill's heart, its weathered bell tower casting long shadows over the gravestones. Generations had passed beneath its slate roof, marriages, funerals, christenings, Confessions. It was the village's heartbeat, with chambers never meant to be opened. That morning, Miss Marple visited the church, not for prayer, but for evidence. She nodded to the curate, sweeping the path, and requested to see Reverend Pato. The vicar, an aging man with thin hair and ink-stained cuffs, welcomed her into his study, where papers teetered in stacks and pipe tobacco lingered in the air. "I was hoping," Miss Marple began, "to examine your parish ledgers, particularly baptism and guardianship records from 1931 to 1933. "You don't mean this is about that business with the grave?" Pottle asked, raising a bushy brow in a manner of speaking. "Well," he huffed, standing with effort there in the lower vestry, "but mind your head dreadfully low." He led her down a narrow stone stair behind the altar, through a passage lit by flickering lamps, to a heavy oak door. Beyond it lay St. Jude's archives, cool and musty, with dust swirling in slants of light from high, narrow windows. Shelves held oilskin-wrapped documents and faded folders. An iron cabinet stood in the corner. Pottle handed her a ring of brass keys. "Take all the time you need, Miss Marple. I'll be upstairs if you need stronger reading glasses." Thanked him and set to work, starting with the 1932 baptismal register. She flipped through neat entries. January 3rd, Lillian Cooper. February 11th, Thomas Michael Graves. March 28th blank. An entry with only initials, J.M., no parents listed. A note read, "Private guardianship, authorized by Reverend D. Withers, infant healthy." No further instruction. Her mouth tightened. She checked the guardianship register. There, in Reverend Withers' angular hand, May 1932. Lydia Hargrave, temporary guardian of male infant, J.M., no surname. Origin, St. Catherine's Hospital, Bath. Duration, indefinite. Miss Marple exhaled. There had been a child, neither hers nor Lydia's, by birth. The hospital had transferred an infant, likely an orphan, to Lydia's care, as she had raised him, or sent him elsewhere. But why hide it unless she was concealing something deeper? The lower cabinet, among burial receipts and floral invoices, she found an anomaly. July 1932. Grave prepared under supervision of Reverend Withers. Name, J.M., infant, cuz, stillbirth, recorded late. Note, body not inspected, per guardian's request to avoid autopsy. Miss Marple stared. The child was listed as stillborn, but no doctor had confirmed it. No death certificate existed, unquestioned. Her breath caught. Had Lydia falsified the child's death? Stairs. Pottle was polishing a candlestick. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked gently. "In part," she replied, "though it raises questions, like why a child was listed as stillborn, when he may well have lived." Pottle looked alarmed. That would be a terrible breach of church and civil law. "An act of desperation," she said softly. "Or compassion. Perhaps both." That afternoon, Inspector Cray waited outside her gate, looking uneasy. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "sorry to trouble you, but something's happened." She gestured to the garden bench. "I'm listening." Cray didn't sit. His discomfort was unusual for a man who scolded sergeants while buttering toast. "It's about Margaret Parker. I've reason to believe she's involved in something tied to Leonard Daffodil's death." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Go on." Chapter 7. The Ashes of Truth. Miss Marple sat by her fireplace, the crackle of burning logs filling the quiet of her cottage. Nora, her young neighbor, sat across from her, eyes wide with unease. The key to the mystery had begun to take shape, not just motive, but opportunity. Margaret Parker had both. She had watched, waited, And now, the third piece of the puzzle, the note. Margaret Parker is clever, Miss Marple said, more to herself than to Nora. She wouldn't make an obvious move. She'd plant seeds of suspicion without ever being caught. She'd send a message without being noticed. I don't understand, Nora said, her voice trembling. The envelope, Miss Marple replied, her gaze fixed on the fire. The note I received, unsigned. It didn't come from Leonard, as I first thought. It came from someone who knew too much, someone who wanted me to ask the right questions. She paused, letting the words settle. The note said, the widow has lied. Ask her what she burned. Nora's face paled. You think Margaret burned something? That she lied? I believe she did, Miss Marple said softly. The truth is often hidden in what people try to destroy. The note she burned was her confession, twisted of course. She wanted to control the narrative, to make Leonard's death seem random, not the result of a grudge. Why burn it? Tina whispered. Because once it was gone, it left no trace, Miss Marple said, her mind racing. The letter told the truth, but only for a moment. Now it's ashes, and we're left with pieces of the puzzle. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had a plan. She needed to confront Margaret Parker to see what lingered in the woman's eyes. Margaret's cottage stood at the village's edge, shrouded in overgrown ivy and shaded by tall oaks. The windows, usually open to the breeze, were shuttered. The garden was wild. UNTA map. Miss Marple knocked softly. The door opened after a moment. Miss Marple, Margaret Parker said, her voice tinged with surprise, her posture tense. What can I do for you? Was hoping to have a word, Miss Marple said quietly. It's about Leonard. Margaret stiffened. You don't need to look so frightened, Miss Marple said with a kind smile. I'm not here to accuse. I simply want to understand. Understand? Margaret's voice trembled. What is there to understand? Leonard is dead. He never understood me. Yet he sent you something, Miss Marple said. A flower. Margaret's face blanched. No, he didn't. Not directly, Miss Marple continued, but his actions spoke louder than any letter. He was watching you, Margaret, and you wanted him to notice. Margaret took a step back, her hands trembling. I never wanted him to see me. I wanted him to leave me alone. And yet, Miss Marple said, her voice growing colder, you sent a note. You burned it, but I believe you wrote it. You wanted to destroy Leonard's life, to claim power over him. I didn't. I couldn't, Margaret whispered, her face a mix of fear and regret. I never wanted him dead. I wanted him to pay for ignoring me, for leaving me behind, for choosing others over me. Miss Marple stepped closer, her face gentle but firm. Okay? And now the question remains. Margaret, did you kill Leonard Daffodil? Or did someone else, knowing your pain, take that step for you? Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but her lips remained sealed. The silence stretched between them. Miss Marple didn't need an answer, not yet. Chapter 8. The Final Confession. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage. Rose Hill, once alive with gossip, now felt frozen in time, the air thick with anticipation. The stillness unsettled her, stillness of a village that had witnessed tragedy but hadn't grasped its consequences. Inside, its fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Miss Marple stood in the doorway, her gaze lingering on the small wooden table where 3 envelopes and their notes lay. She couldn't shake the image of Margaret Parker's pale, tear-streaked face, confessing her fears, but not her guilt. It wasn't guilt that held Margaret captivate was fear of exposure. Fear of the truth she tried to bury. Miss Marple sat at her desk, her mind piecing together the fragments. Leonard Daffodil's murder wasn't a spontaneous act, okay? It was the culmination of a twisted dance, sparked long before the first flower was sent. The flowers were Leonard's attempt to reach out to the neglected, the overlooked, that they had also touched raw nerves, tipping the scales of power in a small village, who then had crossed the final line. Her fingers traced the edge of the last envelope, the one that had arrived mysteriously, urging her to ask Margaret what she'd burned. The note had turned suspicion into certainty. Who else had a reason to silence Leonard Daffodil? She murmured aloud. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. Gentle, polite, but insistent. The kind that implied someone knew their time had come. Miss Marple rose, her hand reaching for a walking stick, and opened the door to find Evelyn Langton standing on the threshold, her expression one of quiet resolve. Miss Marple, Evelyn said softly, I need to speak with you about Leonard. They sat in the sitting room, the fire crackling between them, shadows of the past lingering in every corner. Evelyn's face was pale, her eyes red from sleepless nights, but there was a quiet strength in her now. I know what you're thinking, Evelyn said, her voice trembling slightly. You think I knew more than I let on, that I knew what Leonard was doing? But I didn't, I swear. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze steady. Then tell me, Evelyn, why did you feel the need to hide the truth? Why did you burn the note you received? Evelyn's face crumpled, as if her guilt had finally caught up with her. I was afraid, she whispered, afraid of what people would think, of what I might have felt, of what Leonard's actions meant. Miss Marple's eyes softened. But you never had a chance to ask him, did you? Evelyn met her gaze. No, I didn't. And now he's dead. Miss Marple leaned back, choosing her words carefully. But you knew someone who did have that chance. Evelyn looked confused. Who? Margaret Parker, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but insistent. She'd been watching Leonard for months, seeing him send flowers to other women. She resented him for it. She hated that he made them feel important, wanted, when she never received so much as a single bloom. Evelyn's face twisted in surprise and horror. You think Margaret killed him? I think Margaret was driven to the edge, Miss Marple said softly. She felt powerless, invisible. Leonard's simple act of sending flowers pushed her over that edge. She burned the note she received from him, but she never destroyed her anger. And in the end, she did what she thought she had to do to make him stop. But she didn't mean to kill him, Evelyn said, her voice shaking. No, Miss Marple agreed. But when you act out of jealousy, out of desperation, you don't always think of the consequences until it's too late. The truth was out, but one question lingered. Evelyn, Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm. Did you see Margaret the night Leonard was killed? Evelyn hesitated, her eyes darting to the window, then back to Miss Marple. I don't know, she whispered. I was so distraught that night. I didn't think to check on anyone. But I saw someone leaving the greenhouse just before the police arrived, and I think it was Margaret. The final pieces fell into place. Miss Marple stood, walking slowly, to the mantel where the firelight cast long shadows across her face. I'll go to the police tomorrow, she said softly, but I believe Margaret Parker was the one who killed Leonard Daffodil, and I believe she did so because she couldn't stand the idea of him giving away what she had always wanted, the attention. The validation, the feeling of being seen stood as well, her face weary but relieved. I never wanted any of this, Miss Marple. I just wanted to be left alone, and now, Miss Marple said gently, "Y'all will be." As the night wore on, Miss Marple sat quietly, the fire now dwindling to embers. She thought of the flowers of third carnations, of their meaning and their message. The truth, after all, had otherwise been there. It had just taken a few petals to bring. It too, like chapter 9, the final act, the rain had stopped, but the sky maid, KB pregnant with the threat of more to come. The air was thick with moisture, yet there was something sharp in the stillness of the morning, a sense of heat. The village of Marley was holding its breath. Miss Marple stood in front of the small grayish police station, her hand wrapped tightly around her walking stick, eye-scanning the distant horizon. She had not planned on being part of the official conclusion after all. The murder was already under investigation. The evidence was now clearant. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. But she felt a quiet, tundable pull to be there. There were a few more threads to be tied, a few more questions to be answered, and she would not rest until the truth was seen in its entirety. Inside, Sergeant Finch was hunched over his desk, his brow furrowed in Connie's concentration as he scanned the notes in front of him. Miss Marple had only met them a few times during her years in Marley, and each time she had been struck by how much effort he put into pretending he was the sharpest man in the room. The thing was, he wasn't in matters of logic. Miss Marple had learned long ago that true brilliance lay not in the noise, but in the quiet morning. Sergeant Keyes said, stepping inside. Finch looked up, startled, then gave a quick smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Miss Marple, he said, standing. What can I do for you? Heart, to give you the last piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple said quietly. Finch blinked. The last piece. She nodded. I've already spoken to Mrs. Langton, and I've met with Miss Pike. And now it's time to talk about that person who really killed Leonard. Daffodil Finch's eyebrows rose. You have some in mind? I do, Miss Marple said firmly. And it's someone who has yet told questioned properly. By the time Miss Marple and Finch arrived at Margaret Parker's cottage, the wind had begun to pick up again, twisting the branches of the oak trees like skeletal hands reaching into the sky. Margaret was standing on the doorstep, her face pale but determined, as though she had been expecting them. Good morning, Miss Marple, she said quietly. Sergeant Finch, I suppose you're here to ask me some questions. Finch cleared his throat. I think the questions have already been answered. Mrs. Parker, he said, his voice firm, but there are still a few things that don't add up, and we're going to get to the bottom of them. Margaret didn't flinch. I'm sure you will, she said, stepping back and motioning them inside ease. Marple walked in first, her eyes quickly scanning the room. The cottage was neat, but there was an unsettling stillness in the air, like a home too carefully constructed to hide its secrets. Do sit down, Margaret said, gesturing to the chairs by the hearth. I'll put the kettle on. I imagine you, Beth, had a long morning. Miss Marple sat down, but Sergeant Fink remained, standing, his posture a little too stiff. I'm afraid I don't understand what this is about, Margaret continued, her voice thin with strain. I've already told you everything I know. I had no reason to kill Leonard. He never wronged in. We were simply two people who had crossed paths again after all those years. Miss Marple smiled faintly. You were lying, Margaret, and the more you ticked, the more obvious it became. Margaret's eyes flickered. Lies echoed. You think yes, you were lying about many things. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. You told me you were not angry with Leonard. You told me you had no reason to harm him, but that's not true, is it? Margaret's face pad further, and she took a step back as if the room was suddenly too small. You see, Miss Marple continued, her voice calm. The one thing you couldn't hide, Margaret, was the fact that Leonard made you feel invisible. He sent flowers to everyone else in the village, but not to you, not once. And that, well, that became an obsession for you, didn't it? Margaret's hand shook. I didn't kill him, she whispered. "I never meant to, but you wanted him to see you," Miss Marple said softly. "You wanted him to notice you. And when he sent flowers to everyone else, you saw it as a rejection, and that made you angry, very angry." Margaret's lips trembled, and she turned away. "I didn't mean to. He didn't deserve it or die." "Of course he didn't," Miss Marple said gently, "but you let your jealousy take root, and you let it grow until it festered into something you couldn't control." "I only wanted him to stop." Margaret's voice cracked. "I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted him to understand how I felt." "You watched him, Margaret," Miss Marple said softly. "You watched him from your window for weeks, and when the flowers stopped coming, you thought, okay, it was your opportunity. You followed him to the greenhouse. That night you confronted him, and in that confrontation, your anger took over." Margaret slumped her face, buried in her hands. "I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered, "but I pushed him. I yelled at him, and he fell into the glass, and that's when I knew." Miss Marple sat back, her hands folded in her lap. "That's when you knew you had to make it look like something else, something accidental." Margaret nodded, tears falling freely. "Now, I panicked. I left him there, and when the scream came from the garden, I knew it was too late." Finch took a long breath and glanced at Miss Marple, his expression hardening with resolve. "You're under arrest for the murder of Leonard Daffodil, Mrs. Parker. He'll be taken to the station for a question." And Margaret didn't resist. She didn't speak. She simply nodded, her face an unreadable mask of guilt and sorrow. Miss Marple stood as well, her expression soft but firm. "The truth always comes to light, Margaret. It may take time, but it always finds its way." As Finch escorted Margaret from the cottage, Miss Marple turned her gaze back to the fireplace. The embers had burned low, leaving only a faint glow that cast long shadows on the walls. The case was closed. The murderer had been caught. The village began to heal its wounds, slowly mending as time passed. But Miss Marple knew that the true crime had never been about the murder. The true crime had been the lies people told themselves, these secrets they buried so deep that they began to fester and poison their every action. In the end, it was always the truth that cut through it all. The truth, like a flower scent, with meaning. Chapter 10, The Final Reflection. The morning after Margaret Parker's Marley Comb was still as it always was after a storm. The streets, freshly washed by the rain, held the quiet reverence of a village that had lived through something it had never expected. It was not the first time murder had touched its shores, but it was the first time it had come so close to the heart, to a story that could not be hidden behind the careful facade of a quaint, peaceful town. As the villagers went about their routines, some with their heads held a little higher, others with their faces a little lower, the truth about Leonard Daffodil settled gently into the background of their lives. Some would whisper about it for years, others would pretend it had never happened. But Miss Marple knew better, sat in her favorite armchair that evening, the fire crackling, softly casting warm shadows across her small sitting room. The letter from the police was still on her table, neatly folded, sealed with a simple acknowledgement, offer assistance in solving the case. It was a formal letter, yet Miss Marple could not help but smile at the small, subtle tribute it paid to her. Miss Marple had never needed praise. It was enough for her to know that the truth had been uncovered, that the story had unfolded exactly as it should have, despite the twists and turns that had momentarily obscured it. The teapot sat quietly on the table, steam rising in delicate wisps. She sipped her tea, savoring the quiet satisfaction that only a case well solved could bring. And yet, despite the peace of the moment, she found herself thinking of something she had learned over the years. Sometimes the most dangerous crimes were not the ones that happened in the shadows, but the ones that festered in the light. People like Leonard Daffodil, who had meant no harm, had nonetheless set into motion a series of events that would alter lives irrevocably. Margaret Parker, too, had been a victim in her own way, a victim of unspoken desires and unmet needs. Her jealousy, her bitterness, had grown into something darker until it consumed her entirely. And that, Miss Marple realized, was the true tragedy of the case. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet village. The cottages were all bathed in the soft light of dusk. The gardens now settled for the season. For a moment, Miss Marple thought of all the years she had lived in Malcolm, of all the faces she had studied, all the quiet moments of human drama she had witnessed, unnoticed by most. It was the hidden things that fascinated her the most, the things people kept buried deep within themselves, hidden behind polite smiles and well-crafted facades. People had so many faces. Miss Marple thought the one these showed the world, and the one they kept hidden. Some wore their secrets close to their chests, while others carried them like an open wound, bleeding slowly. For years, the trick was never to assume you knew a person completely Bavarian. She had learned something else inside, something that could surface at any moment, for better or for worse. And Leonard, poor Leonard, had been a catalyst. And all his flowers meant as nothing more than a simple act of kindness, had inadvertently unlocked a dangerous chain of events. But in the end, Miss Marple knew that it was not the flowers that had killed him. It was the unspoken, emotionless, quiet resentments, the unmet needs. There was a knock at the door. Miss Marple smiled gently to herself. She had been expecting it to come in. She called softly. The door opened, and Yvonne Langton stepped into the room, her expression calm but weary. She had aged a little in the past week, as though the weight of the truth had finally caught up with her. "I thought I'd come by," Evelyn said, her voice soft. "To thank you for everything." Miss Marple motioned to the chair across from her. "Please sit." Evelyn hesitated before sitting down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I still don't know how I feel about all of this. I didn't know if I'm relieved or guilty. Leonard's death, it's changed everything. I was so caught up in my own life, my own loneliness, that I never saw what was happening around me. I never thought someone could be so hurt by something as simple as flowers." Miss Marple nodded, gently understanding more than Evelyn could possibly know. "You were never the cause of it, Evelyn. You were simply a part of a larger story, one that, as it turned out, was more complex than anyone had imagined." Evelyn looked up at her high-rise, tired, and, "What about Margaret? Do you think she's sorry, miss?" Marple's gaze softened. "I think Margaret is sorry for many things, for the way she let Haranja control her, for the things she wished she could have said, but never did. But I do not think she is sorry for what she did not yet." "And the flowers?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely audible. "The flowers were never just flowers, were they, miss?" Marple said softly. "They were symbols of affection, yes, but also of power, of desire, of what Leonard didn't realize he was giving away in the end. The flowers were as much about the giver as they were about the recipient." Eva nodded, slowly processing Miss Marple's words. "I never thought of it like that. I thought it was a innocent innocence. In some cases, is the most dangerous thing of all," Miss Marple said quietly later that evening after Valine had left. Miss Marple sat in the flickering light of the fire, the quiet comfort, the evening settling around her outside the village of Marley Wastel, as it always was after a storm. The events of the past week seemed to have erased, leaving only the memory of a life interrupted. The lives of those involved will never be the same again, but Miss Marple knew that in time, they would heal. People always did, but she would not forget. She would never forget how something as small as a flower could tip the balance of a life, could create cosware. There had been peace. The clock ticked softly and thickened its steady rhythm. like the pulse of the world, and Miss Marple, as she always did, waited for the next case, the next mystery to present itself. She was ready.